The thermometer nailed to the barn's exterior read -23 degrees, but inside Dunbar Macready's cabin, the mercury held steady at 67. What happened in the months after his partner froze to death 200 yards from their door would change how settlers survived Dakota Territory winters. But when Dunbar first announced his plan to build a barn around his cabin, every neighbor within 10 miles thought grief had driven him insane. Before we go further, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from, and if frontier survival ingenuity pulls you in like it does us, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's story might just change how you think about staying warm. Dunbar Macready could hold his breath for 2 full minutes without his hands trembling. He had learned this skill during 3 years as a Union Army sharpshooter, lying in frozen fields waiting for Confederate officers to emerge from their tents. The war had ended in 1865, but the discipline remained. When he homesteaded in Dakota Territory the following spring, he brought that same methodical precision to everything he built, planted, or planned. His neighbors recognized competence when they saw it. Dunbar was the kind of man who measured twice, cut once, and never wasted motion. He had filed his claim in May of 1866 on a quarter section along the James River, good land with timber access and reliable water. His partner, Callum Murchison, had filed the adjacent claim. They had served together in the war, Callum as an infantry sergeant, Dunbar as the sniper attached to Callum's company. The partnership made practical sense. 2 men could build faster, work more land, and survive the isolation that drove solitary homesteaders to abandon their claims or lose their minds. They spent that first summer building a cabin that sat exactly on the property line between their 2 claims, a structure they could both legally occupy while proving up their land. The cabin was well built by frontier standards. Logs chinked tight with clay and moss, a proper stone fireplace with a straight chimney, a door that hung true on iron hinges Dunbar had packed from Fort Pierre, and 2 small windows with actual glass panes, a luxury most homesteaders skipped. The interior measured 16 feet by 20 feet with a sleeping loft accessible by ladder. They built a second structure, a small barn for the 2 horses and the milk cow Callum had driven north from Iowa. Everything was solid, functional, and adequate for the purpose. That first summer and fall passed in the constant work that homesteading demanded. They broke 10 acres for spring planting, cut and stacked 8 cords of firewood, hunted deer and antelope for winter meat, and made the 2-day trip to Fort Pierre twice for supplies they could not produce themselves. The land was good. The water was reliable. The neighbors, scattered across the rolling prairie in their own quarter sections, were helpful without being intrusive. Dunbar and Callum worked well together with the ease of men who had already survived situations far worse than building a farm from raw land. Winter arrived in early November, with temperatures that dropped steadily but not catastrophically. They burned through firewood at a rate Dunbar tracked carefully in a small notebook he kept on the mantel. The cabin stayed warm enough when the fire was kept going, cold enough when it was not, that they could see their breath in the mornings before rebuilding the fire. It was uncomfortable but manageable, exactly what they had expected from a Dakota winter. The blizzard struck on November 19, 1866, without the warning signs experienced plainsmen watched for. The morning had been cold but clear, temperature hovering near 0, wind calm. Callum left after breakfast to check their trapline along the river, a routine task that usually took 3 hours. Dunbar stayed at the cabin to repair harness leather and splice rope. By midday, the sky had darkened to a peculiar gray-green color that made the hair on Dunbar's neck stand up. The wind hit first, a sudden gust that rattled the cabin door and sent loose snow swirling across the prairie. Within minutes, the temperature dropped so fast Dunbar could feel it through the cabin walls. He stepped outside and could barely see the barn 30 feet away. The blizzard had arrived with the speed of cavalry charge, visibility dropping to arm's length, wind driving snow horizontally with enough force to sting exposed skin. Dunbar knew immediately that Callum was in serious trouble. He tied a rope from the cabin door to the barn, then from the barn to the woodpile, creating a lifeline system. He brought the horses and cow into the barn and gave them extra hay, knowing he might not be able to reach them again for days. Back in the cabin, he fed the fire and waited, listening for any sound of Callum's return over the howl of wind. Hours passed. The light faded early as it did in November. Dunbar kept the fire large enough that its glow would be visible from outside if Callum managed to get close. The blizzard continued through the night without pause. Dunbar did not sleep. He kept the fire burning bright and stepped outside every hour, shouting Callum's name into the wind, knowing the sound would not carry 20 feet. At dawn, the wind finally began to ease. By mid-morning, the snow had stopped, and visibility improved enough to see 100 yards. Dunbar dressed in every layer he owned, wrapped his face against the cold, and went searching. He found Callum 200 yards from the cabin, lying in a drift near the small creek that ran between their property and the next section. Callum had made it most of the way home. His body showed he had been trying to reach the cabin when hypothermia had taken him. He had removed his coat, a common behavior in the final stages of freezing when victims feel intensely hot and strip off clothing. His hands showed where he had tried to dig into the snow, perhaps attempting to create shelter. The blizzard had buried him by morning under 2 feet of new snow. Dunbar carried Callum's body back to the cabin. The ground was frozen too hard to dig a grave. He wrapped Callum in canvas and placed him in the barn until spring thaw would allow proper burial. That night, sitting alone in the cabin that suddenly felt enormous and empty, Dunbar realized that Callum had died within shouting distance of safety, separated from warmth and survival by less than 3 minutes of walking in clear weather. Dunbar buried Callum in May, when the ground finally thawed enough to dig. He chose a spot on the hillside, overlooking both their claims, marked it with a wooden cross he carved from oak, and spent the rest of that day sitting beside the grave, trying to understand what survival actually meant. Callum had been strong, experienced, and careful. He had died anyway because a blizzard arrived faster than expected, and cold killed without mercy or warning. The mathematics were simple and brutal. The cabin had not been enough. That realization changed how Dunbar saw everything he had built. The cabin that had seemed solid and well-constructed now revealed itself as barely adequate. He began noticing things he had accepted without question before Callum's death. The way frost built up on the interior walls near the corners where chinking was slightly less perfect. The way wind found its way through gaps he could not see, but could feel when he held his hand near the walls. The way the fire needed constant feeding to maintain comfortable temperature, and how quickly the interior cold returned if the fire died down even for a few hours. He tracked firewood consumption with the same precision he had once tracked ammunition expenditure. 1 cord of wood lasted approximately 12 days when burned continuously to maintain interior temperature above 50 degrees. 8 cords would last 96 days. Dakota winters regularly exceeded 120 days of freezing temperatures. The deficit was manageable only by allowing the cabin to drop to barely survivable temperatures at night, banking the fire and huddling under every blanket he owned, then rebuilding heat each morning. It worked, but it was a constant battle against cold that seeped through every surface. In January, during a cold snap that pushed temperatures to -18 degrees, Dunbar experienced his first serious brush with frostbite. He had gone to the barn to feed the animals and spent 20 minutes working in the cold. When he returned to the cabin, 3 fingers on his left hand had gone white and numb. He thawed them carefully by the fire, enduring the painful burning sensation as circulation returned. The experience terrified him more than enemy fire ever had. In war, you could see threats and respond. Cold was invisible, patient, and absolutely certain. He began visiting neighboring homesteads whenever weather permitted, studying how others dealt with winter. Most cabins were similar to his own. Some were worse, chinked poorly or built with green logs that had shrunk and cracked. A few were slightly better, built by men with carpentry experience who understood joinery and proper construction. But none were fundamentally different. Everyone accepted that winter meant cold, that staying warm meant burning enormous amounts of wood, and that going outside in blizzard conditions meant risking death. These were simply facts of Dakota homesteading, as unchangeable as the seasons themselves. Spring of 1867 brought the kind of weather that made men forget winter and believe the land was generous. Dunbar planted his fields, tended his animals, and spent every spare moment thinking about cold. He could not shake the image of Callum frozen 200 yards from the cabin, so close to survival but unable to reach it. The problem consumed him with the same focused intensity he had once applied to calculating bullet drop and wind drift at 800 yards. He began traveling to other homesteads with specific questions. Not social visits, but methodical interviews. How much firewood did they burn per week? What was their coldest interior temperature? Had they experienced frostbite? How did they seal gaps? What did they use for chinking? Most homesteaders thought his questions were odd, but answered readily enough. Settlers helped each other because survival often depended on it. Dunbar compiled their answers in his notebook, creating a detailed survey of how 24 families dealt with Dakota winter. The data revealed patterns. Cabins built with larger diameter logs stayed warmer because thermal mass absorbed and retained heat longer. Cabins positioned to block prevailing north wind performed better than those exposed to direct wind. Cabins with double-layer roofs, even crude ones using bark under sod, lost less heat through the ceiling. But even the best cabins still consumed enormous amounts of firewood and still dropped to dangerously cold temperatures during the worst weather. Everyone was fighting the same battle, with slightly better or worse versions of the same inadequate solution. Dunbar expanded his research beyond cabins. He examined root cellars, noting how underground structures maintained stable, cool temperatures even when surface conditions varied wildly. He studied the small barn he shared with Callum, paying attention to how the structure felt when he entered on cold mornings. The barn was never warm, but it was noticeably less cold than outside. The animal's body heat contributed, but even empty sections of the barn were warmer than exterior temperature. The building itself was providing some protection beyond simple wind blocking. He visited Fort Pierre in June and spent 3 days talking to the post carpenter, a Norwegian immigrant named Svensson who had built structures in climates far colder than Dakota. Svensson explained thermal principles in heavily accented English. Heat rises, cold sinks. Air movement carries heat away. Still air insulates. Mass stores heat. Gaps bleed warmth. Each principle was simple, but Dunbar began seeing how they interacted. A cabin was not just walls and roof. It was a system for managing heat transfer. And most cabins managed it poorly because they were designed primarily for speed and simplicity of construction, not thermal efficiency. He returned home in late June with his mind full of half-formed ideas. He knew what did not work. Standard cabin construction was inadequate. He knew what principles mattered: thermal mass, air gaps, wind protection, sealed construction. What he did not yet know was how to combine these principles into something he could actually build with available materials and skills. The insight came on a July morning when Dunbar was mucking out the barn. He had been working for an hour in the cool dimness, the temperature outside already climbing toward 80 degrees as summer heat built across the prairie. He stepped outside to dump a wheelbarrow of soiled straw and was struck by the temperature difference. The barn interior had felt comfortable, almost cool. The exterior air hit him like a physical force, hot and oppressive. He went back inside and simply stood there, paying attention to what his body was telling him. The barn was significantly cooler than outside despite having no insulation and gaps between boards wide enough to see daylight. The building was essentially a shell, yet it was moderating temperature. Dunbar began analyzing why. The roof blocked direct sunlight from hitting the interior space. The walls created shade. But more importantly, the structure created a buffer zone of still air between the exterior environment and the interior space. That dead air layer was insulating the inside from outside temperature extremes. He thought about winter. The same barn that stayed cooler in summer stayed warmer in winter. Not warm by any standard, but less cold than outside. On a morning when exterior temperature was 0, the barn interior might be 15 or 20 degrees. The animals contributed heat, but even before he brought them in for the season, the barn held temperature better than open air. The building was not heated, yet it resisted temperature change in both directions. It was a passive thermal buffer. Dunbar walked the perimeter of the barn, examining its construction with new attention. Simple vertical board siding over a post and beam frame. Roof made from rough-cut planks covered with tar paper and shakes. Dirt floor. Nothing sophisticated, yet the structure created a measurable microclimate inside its walls. He walked back to his cabin and stood outside it, looking at the building he had thought was well constructed. The cabin was designed to be heated. It had a fireplace, tight chinking, proper door and windows. Yet it bled heat constantly, requiring continuous fire to maintain temperature. The idea arrived fully formed, so obvious he wondered why he had not seen it immediately. If a simple barn could moderate temperature through nothing but creating a shell of still air, what would happen if he built a barn around his cabin? The cabin could be heated as it was now, but instead of losing that heat directly to exterior air through walls and roof, it would lose heat into the barn space. The barn would capture that escaped heat, warming its interior. The cabin would then be surrounded not by freezing exterior air, but by air that was substantially warmer. The barn would become a massive insulating layer, a buffer zone between heated living space and deadly cold. He spent the rest of that day sitting on the hillside near Callum's grave, working through the concept. The mathematics made sense. If a barn naturally stayed 20 degrees warmer than outside, and the cabin maintained temperature inside the barn, the cabin would need far less heat input, less firewood burned, more stable interior temperature, greater margin of safety during extreme cold. The solution was not building a better cabin. It was building a second structure around the cabin. Dunbar announced his plan in early August at a barn raising for a new settler named Henderson, who had filed a claim 5 miles west. A dozen homesteaders had gathered to help with the construction, a common practice where community labor made large projects possible. During the midday meal break, when men sat in the shade eating bread and cold meat, Dunbar described what he intended to build. He kept his explanation simple and factual. A barn, 40 feet by 30 feet, built around his existing cabin, creating an air gap of approximately 8 to 10 feet on all sides. The response was immediate laughter. Henderson thought Dunbar was joking. A man named Garrett asked if Dunbar had been drinking. Someone else suggested the isolation had affected his mind. When they realized Dunbar was serious, the laughter turned to concern and then to blunt criticism. Building a barn around a cabin made no sense. It was a waste of lumber, time, and money. If Dunbar wanted a barn, he should build it near the cabin like a normal person. If he wanted a warmer cabin, he should build thicker walls or add a second layer of logs. The idea of enclosing one building inside another struck them as the plan of a man who had lost his grip on practical reality. Dunbar did not argue. He explained his reasoning once, describing thermal principles and the buffer zone concept. The men listened politely, but clearly thought he was overthinking a simple problem. Several offered earnest advice. Add more chinking, build a bigger fireplace, cut more firewood, bank earth against the cabin walls. These were proven methods that practical men used. Dunbar's plan sounded like something an educated fool from back east might attempt, all theory and no common sense. When the meal break ended and work resumed, the conversation shifted to normal topics. But Dunbar caught men glancing at him with expressions mixing pity and doubt. Word spread quickly across the scattered homesteading community. Within 2 weeks, Dunbar's plan was known to everyone within 20 miles. Some thought it was interesting but impractical. Most thought it was foolish. A few thought it was evidence that Callum's death had damaged Dunbar's judgment. A homesteader named Mackenzie rode over specifically to talk Dunbar out of the plan, arguing that the lumber and labor required would be better spent on productive improvements like fencing or a proper barn for equipment and animals. Dunbar listened, thanked Mackenzie for his concern, and continued his preparations. The criticism bothered him less than it might have before the war. He had spent 3 years making decisions that meant life or death, often overruling officers who outranked him when his assessment of shooting conditions contradicted their tactical preferences. He had learned to trust his own analysis, even when others disagreed. The thermal principles were sound. The mathematics worked. Whether neighbors understood or approved was irrelevant to whether the design would function. He had one objective, which was to build shelter that would prevent what happened to Callum from happening to him. If achieving that objective required appearing foolish to his neighbors, that was an acceptable cost. Dunbar began construction in mid-August after the wheat harvest was complete. He started by establishing exact measurements, using stakes and string to lay out a rectangle 40 feet by 30 feet with his cabin centered inside. The dimensions gave him an 8-foot gap on the long sides, 10 feet on the ends. He had calculated these distances carefully. 8 feet was wide enough to prevent heat transfer by direct radiation from cabin walls to barn walls, but narrow enough that the enclosed volume could be warmed by heat escaping the cabin. Wider gaps would create too much air volume to heat effectively. Narrower gaps would reduce the insulation benefit. The foundation required 2 weeks of hard labor. Unlike his cabin, which sat directly on earth, the barn needed a proper foundation to support its weight and prevent settling. He dug a trench 18 inches deep around the entire perimeter, working in the August heat with the same methodical persistence he brought to everything. The soil was dense clay mixed with rocks, difficult digging that left his hands blistered despite work-hardened calluses. He filled the trench with rocks he gathered from a coulee half a mile away, hauling them in his wagon load by load. The rock foundation served multiple purposes. It raised the wooden sill beams above ground moisture, preventing rot. It distributed the building's weight across the trench rather than concentrating it on posts. It created a level base for construction, essential for a structure this size. Dunbar checked level constantly using a simple water level he made from a length of rubber tubing filled with water. The foundation had to be precise. Any deviation would compound as the walls rose, creating structural problems that would worsen over time. Once the foundation was complete, he set the sill beams, massive timbers 12 inches square that formed the base of the wall structure. He had ordered these from a sawmill in Yankton, paying for delivery by wagon. The cost was substantial, eating into the money he had saved from selling his wheat crop. His neighbors who saw the lumber arrive shook their heads. That much quality timber represented months of income being invested in a building they still considered irrational. Dunbar ignored their opinions and focused on construction. He anchored the sill beams to the foundation using wooden pegs driven through the beams into gaps between rocks, creating a connection that would resist lateral movement. The corners were joined using mortise and tenon joints he cut by hand, precise work that took an entire day per corner. Each joint was secured with wooden pins rather than nails. The resulting frame was rigid enough that he could stand on one end and jump without creating any movement in the structure. This rigidity was essential. The barn would need to support heavy snow loads through Dakota winters. Any weakness in the foundation would propagate through the entire structure. By early September, the foundation and sill frame were complete. The basic footprint of the barn now existed as a solid rectangle surrounding his cabin. Standing inside what would become the barn, looking at his cabin centered in the space, Dunbar could see the design taking physical form. Neighbors who visited still expressed skepticism, but the quality of his foundation work was undeniable. Whatever else the structure might be, it was being built properly. The vertical posts went up in late September as the weather began its slow shift toward autumn. Dunbar had cut and shaped 20 posts from straight pine trees he had selected the previous spring, allowing them to season through summer. Each post measured 10 inches square and 16 feet long, substantial timber designed to support significant weight. He positioned posts every 8 feet around the perimeter, creating a framework that would bear the roof load and resist wind pressure that could reach violent intensities during winter storms. Setting the posts required precision and considerable physical effort. He dug post holes 3 feet deep using a post hole digger and shovel, then set each post vertically and braced it temporarily with diagonal supports while he checked plumb in both directions. Once satisfied the post was perfectly vertical, he backfilled the hole with rocks and tamped earth, creating a solid anchor. The process took most of a day per post. His neighbors thought this was excessive. Standard barn construction used posts set 18 inches deep, adequate for normal agricultural buildings. Dunbar was building to different standards. The top plates went on next, horizontal beams that connected the posts and would support the roof structure. He had planned these connections carefully, using mortise and tenon joints similar to those in the foundation. Each joint required precise cutting, test fitting, adjustment, and final assembly. The work was slow, but resulted in connections far stronger than simple nailed joints. When he drove the final wooden pins securing the last top plate in early October, the barn framework stood complete, a skeleton of heavy timber surrounding his cabin. The structure impressed even skeptical neighbors. McKinsey visited and admitted the framework was built better than most permanent buildings. The posts were plumb, the top plates level, the joints tight. Whatever reservations people had about the concept, the execution was beyond criticism. Dunbar accepted the compliment without comment and began work on the roof structure, knowing winter was approaching and he needed the building enclosed before snow arrived. The roof design used heavy rafters spanning the 30-foot width, supported at the peak by a ridge beam and at the edges by the top plates. He had calculated the roof pitch at 8/12, steep enough to shed snow, but not so steep that construction became dangerous. Each rafter was cut from a single timber, shaped to precise angles where it met the ridge beam and top plates. He notched each connection, creating a mechanical interlock that distributed weight across multiple contact points rather than relying solely on nails. Installing the rafters required assistance. Each timber weighed over 100 pounds and had to be lifted to the top of the 16-foot posts. Dunbar recruited help from Alastair Drummond, a neighbor who lived 3 miles east. Drummond still thought the project was strange, but respected quality work and agreed to help for 2 days. Together, they set 12 rafters, spacing them precisely 30 inches apart. The resulting roof frame was strong enough that Dunbar could walk across the rafters without fear of breaking through. The siding went on through October as temperatures dropped and the first light snows dusted the prairie. Dunbar used vertical board and batten construction, a technique that provided weather protection while allowing some air movement to prevent moisture buildup. The boards were rough-cut pine, each 12 inches wide and 16 feet long, running from sill beam to top plate. He nailed them to the horizontal girts he had installed between posts, spacing the boards with quarter-inch gaps. Over these gaps he nailed battens, narrow strips that covered the openings while allowing air to pass behind them. The technique created a wall that was weatherproof but not airtight, which was exactly what Dunbar wanted. Complete air sealing would trap moisture inside the barn space, potentially causing rot or mold. The small gaps behind the battens allowed moisture-laden air to escape while preventing rain, snow, and wind from penetrating. He had seen similar construction on warehouses in Fort Pierre and understood its advantages for a large, unheated structure. The barn would breathe, maintaining air quality while still providing substantial protection from the elements. The roof required more complex construction. Over the rafters he laid rough-cut planks as decking, each plank nailed to multiple rafters to distribute load. The decking created a solid surface, but with small gaps between planks for ventilation. Over this, he installed a layer of tar paper, overlapping each sheet like shingles to create a waterproof membrane. Finally, he applied cedar shakes, small wooden tiles that he split by hand from cedar logs he had traded for with another settler. The shakes overlapped in courses, each row covering the gaps in the row below. The result was a 3-layer roof that would shed water, resist wind, and last for decades. The steep pitch meant snow would slide off rather than accumulating to dangerous weight. The ventilation between layers prevented moisture buildup that could rot the decking. The cedar shakes were naturally resistant to decay and would weather to a silver gray that required no maintenance. Dunbar was building a roof that would outlast him, perhaps by generations. By early November, the barn was enclosed except for the door openings. The structure now stood complete around his cabin, a dark wooden shell that rose 16 feet at the walls and 22 feet at the peak. The dimensions were substantial. The enclosed volume was approximately 19,000 cubic feet. His cabin, sitting centered inside, occupied less than 3,000 cubic feet. The ratio was deliberate. The large barn volume would be warmed by heat escaping the cabin, creating a buffer zone that would moderate temperature extremes. The barn doors were the final major construction element. Dunbar built them oversized, 12 feet wide and 14 feet tall, large enough to drive a loaded wagon through if necessary. Each door was assembled from vertical planks reinforced with diagonal bracing, hung on heavy strap hinges he had ordered from a blacksmith in Yankton. The doors could be opened fully for access or closed and barred from inside for weather protection. The door system required solving multiple problems simultaneously. The barn needed large openings for access, but those openings could not compromise thermal performance. Cold air is heavy and sinks. An opening at ground level would allow the warmer air inside the barn to escape, replaced by freezing exterior air. Dunbar needed doors that sealed well when closed, and a system that minimized heat loss even when doors were opened. His solution combined practical carpentry with an understanding of how air moved. The main barn doors faced south, positioned to receive maximum sunlight in winter and protected from prevailing north winds. This orientation was deliberate. Southern exposure would allow winter sun to warm the barn interior when doors were open. Protection from north wind meant cold air would not blast directly into the barn during storms. These factors might seem minor, but Dunbar was accumulating every small advantage he could engineer into the design. Each door was built using tongue and groove planks, creating a surface that was effectively continuous when closed. He reinforced them with Z-pattern bracing using 2x6 timbers bolted through the planks. The doors were heavy, each weighing approximately 200 pounds, but the weight helped them seal against the door frame. He installed rubber gaskets around the frame perimeter, strips cut from old wagon tire material he had saved. When the doors closed, the rubber compressed, creating a seal that blocked air infiltration. The hinge design was crucial. Standard strap hinges would work, but would also create gaps where cold air could leak past. Dunbar used offset hinges that pulled the doors tight against the frame as they closed, increasing seal compression. He mounted the hinges with through bolts rather than screws, creating connections that would not loosen over time. The doors could be secured from inside using a heavy bar that dropped into iron brackets, effectively locking them against any force, including high wind. But the main barn doors were only part of the system. Dunbar built a second, smaller entry door, cut into one of the large barn doors. This personnel door measured 3 feet wide by 6.5 feet tall, large enough for a man to pass through, but small enough that opening it would not dump all the warm air from the barn interior. The small door had its own frame, hinges, and latch, creating a door within a door. For daily use during winter, Dunbar would only open this small door, minimizing air exchange. The final element was what Dunbar called the mudroom, though it was not actually a separate room. Just inside the small entry door, he built a partial wall that created a small alcove. Someone entering would pass through the door, step into the alcove behind the partial wall, close the door, then walk around the wall into the main barn space. This simple maze created an airlock effect. Cold air that entered when the door opened would be trapped in the alcove rather than flowing directly into the barn. The warmth inside would not escape. November brought freezing temperatures and the urgent need to complete interior work before winter arrived in full force. Dunbar focused on details that would maximize the barn's thermal performance. He started by whitewashing the interior barn walls with a mixture of lime, water, and salt. The white surface would reflect light and heat rather than absorbing it. Any warmth radiating from the cabin would bounce off the barn walls back toward the cabin rather than being lost into the wood. The effect was subtle but measurable. Light-colored interiors stayed warmer than dark ones. He built storage shelves along the barn walls, utilizing the dead space between cabin and barn exterior. These shelves would hold firewood, tools, grain sacks, and supplies that needed protection from weather, but did not require heated storage. Keeping firewood inside the barn meant it would stay dry and would warm to barn temperature before burning, improving combustion efficiency. Frozen firewood burned poorly, producing less heat and more creosote buildup in the chimney. Room temperature wood burned cleanly and hot. The ventilation system required careful planning. The barn needed air exchange to prevent moisture accumulation and maintain air quality, but that exchange could not simply dump warm air and replace it with cold. Dunbar installed a cupola on the barn roof peak, a small windowed structure that served multiple purposes. It provided natural light to the barn interior during daytime. More importantly, it created a vent for warm, moist air to escape. Warm air rises naturally. The cupola at the highest point allowed that air to exit without creating drafts at ground level. He built shutters for the cupola windows that could be adjusted to control airflow. Fully open in mild weather for maximum ventilation. Partially closed in cold weather to retain heat while still allowing moisture to escape. The system was passive, requiring no mechanical components, working through natural convection. Warm air from the cabin would heat the barn space. That warmed air would rise to the cupola and exit. Fresh air would enter through small vents he installed near ground level on the south wall, again using natural air movement rather than forced circulation. Around the cabin itself, inside the barn, Dunbar left the space open, except for a walking path he defined with small wooden curbs. This open space served as a thermal buffer, but also as working area. He could perform tasks like splitting kindling, repairing equipment, or processing game inside the barn during winter without exposing himself to exterior cold. The barn became an extension of his living space, a workshop that was unheated but protected. He installed simple amenities that would make winter life easier. A workbench against one barn wall, hooks for hanging tools, harness, and clothing, a sawbuck for cutting firewood to length, a grinding wheel for sharpening axes and knives. These were not strictly necessary for thermal performance, but they made the barn functional as more than just an insulating shell. The structure was becoming a comprehensive winter survival system, rather than simply a building around another building. The first serious cold arrived in late November, temperature dropping to 5 degrees overnight. Dunbar woke before dawn, added wood to the fire that he had banked the previous evening, and waited for light. When he could see well enough, he checked the 3 thermometers he had positioned strategically. One hung outside on the barn's exterior wall, one hung inside the barn near the center of the space, one hung inside the cabin near the door. The readings told him immediately that his design was working. Exterior temperature read 5 degrees. Barn interior read 28 degrees. Cabin interior read 56 degrees, and that was after the fire had burned low overnight. The barn was 23 degrees warmer than outside air, despite having no heat source. The temperature differential was being created purely by the barn capturing heat that escaped through the cabin walls and roof. That escaping heat, which would normally be lost to the atmosphere, was instead warming the barn space. The barn then provided warmer surrounding air for the cabin, reducing the temperature gradient the cabin walls had to resist. Dunbar rebuilt his fire and monitored temperatures as the cabin warmed. By mid-morning, exterior temperature had risen to 12 degrees as weak winter sun provided minimal warming. Barn interior had climbed to 34 degrees. Cabin interior reached 68 degrees with a moderate fire, comfortable working temperature. He recorded these numbers in his notebook, starting a data collection project that would continue throughout winter. The numbers were not just satisfaction of curiosity, they were proof that his mathematics had been correct. Over the following weeks, as December brought colder weather, the pattern held consistent. The barn interior typically maintained temperature 20 to 30 degrees warmer than exterior, varying based on wind speed, cloud cover, and how much heat was escaping from the cabin. The cabin interior stayed comfortable, with approximately half the firewood consumption Dunbar had burned the previous winter. Where he had previously burned a full cord every 12 days, he was now using a cord every 24 days. The fuel savings alone would pay for barn construction within several years. But the real advantage was not financial. It was the margin of safety. The previous winter, if Dunbar's fire went out overnight, the cabin would drop to near exterior temperature within hours, potentially freezing water, creating dangerous cold, or in worst case, threatening survival. Now, if the fire went out, the cabin would cool slowly, buffered by the barn space. The barn itself would retain heat for many hours, providing time to restart the fire without entering crisis conditions. This resilience was what Dunbar had been seeking, protection against the kind of emergency that had killed Callum. The cabin's interior environment was also more stable. Previously, temperature would swing wildly based on fire intensity and exterior conditions. Near the fire might be uncomfortably hot, while corners of the cabin remained cold. Now, with the barn moderating exterior temperature extremes, the cabin maintained more even temperature throughout. The space was simply more pleasant to occupy, less drafty, more consistent, genuinely comfortable rather than merely survivable. January brought weather that tested both the barn and every other structure across Dakota Territory. A high-pressure system settled over the northern plains, creating conditions meteorologists would later recognize as an extreme Arctic outbreak. Temperature dropped steadily through the first week of January, reaching -15 degrees by January 9th. Then it kept falling. -18, -22, By January 12th, Dunbar's exterior thermometer read -25 degrees at dawn, the coldest temperature he had ever personally experienced. Across the scattered homesteads, families fought desperate battles against cold. Fireplaces and stoves were fed continuously, consuming firewood at rates that depleted winter supplies alarmingly fast. Water froze despite being kept indoors. Gaps around doors and windows became sources of frost that built up on interior walls. Some families moved their beds directly next to heating stoves, the only way to stay warm enough to sleep. Animals in unheated barns suffered, some freezing despite their natural cold tolerance. The cold was not just uncomfortable, it was genuinely life-threatening. Dunbar's barn cabin system performed beyond his expectations. On the morning of January 12th, with exterior temperature at -25, his barn interior read +8 degrees, a 33-degree differential. His cabin interior maintained 65 degrees with a fire that was large but not excessive. He was warm, not merely surviving, but genuinely comfortable. He wore a single layer of wool clothing indoors. His water bucket remained liquid. The frost that appeared on his cabin walls the previous winter was absent because the cabin walls never dropped below freezing. He increased his fire slightly, bringing cabin temperature to 70 degrees, testing the system's limits. The barn interior warmed to 15 degrees as more heat escaped the cabin. He opened the small entry door and stepped into the barn space. At 15 degrees, the air felt cold but not dangerous. He could work in the barn wearing a heavy coat for extended periods without risk of frostbite. By contrast, the -25-degree exterior air was dangerous within minutes of exposure. The barn had created a protected environment where he could function without full survival gear. The cold snap lasted 8 days. Dunbar tracked temperatures and firewood consumption daily. His calculations showed he was using wood at approximately 40% the rate required by a standard cabin in these conditions. More significantly, his cabin never dropped below 60 degrees, even when he allowed the fire to burn very low overnight. The thermal mass of the barn space acted as a buffer, absorbing heat when the cabin was warm and releasing it slowly when the cabin cooled. The system was self-regulating, passive, requiring no intervention or monitoring. Word spread quickly about Dunbar's comfortable situation. Neighbors struggling to survive the cold heard through the informal communication network that homesteaders used. Mackenzie visited on January 15th, making the difficult journey in brutal cold specifically to see Dunbar's setup. When Dunbar opened the small barn door to admit him, Mackenzie stepped from -20-degree exterior air into +12-degree barn interior. His expression changed immediately from skepticism to understanding. He had crossed from survival conditions to tolerable conditions in a single step. Mackenzie spent 2 hours examining every aspect of the barn cabin system, asking detailed questions about construction costs, time investment, and most importantly, the temperature differentials Dunbar had documented. Dunbar showed him the notebook where he had recorded daily readings since November. The data was comprehensive and consistent. Across varying exterior temperatures from +20 degrees to -25 degrees, the barn interior maintained an average differential of 25 to 30 degrees warmer than outside. The cabin interior stayed comfortable with dramatically reduced fuel consumption. Mackenzie was particularly interested in the worst-case scenarios. What happened during windstorms when cold air was driven against the structure? Dunbar's data showed the barn cabin system performed even better under those conditions. Wind increased heat loss from the barn's exterior, but the barn's mass and volume meant that effect was distributed across a large surface area. The cabin, protected inside the barn, experienced no direct wind exposure. The still air in the barn space remained warm, regardless of wind conditions outside. A traditional cabin lost heat rapidly during high wind, as moving air stripped warmth from exterior walls. The barn eliminated that effect entirely. The firewood savings were documented with equal precision. Dunbar had burned 2 1/4 cords of wood from November through mid-January, a period of 76 days. At his previous consumption rate, he would have burned 6 cords over the same period. The difference represented substantial labor and cost savings. More importantly, it represented security. With 8 cords cut and stacked, Dunbar had enough fuel to run his system through March, even if weather prevented cutting additional wood. A standard cabin would have exhausted that supply by late February. Mackenzie examined the construction details closely. He measured the air gap between cabin and barn walls, noted the door design, studied the ventilation system, and asked about moisture management. Dunbar explained that condensation had been a concern, but had not materialized as a problem. The barn's natural ventilation through the cupola and small ground-level vents created enough air movement to prevent moisture buildup without creating drafts or significant heat loss. The system breathed naturally, maintaining air quality while retaining warmth. The conversation shifted to practicality. Could this design be replicated by a typical homesteader? Dunbar was honest about the challenges. The barn required significant lumber investment, perhaps $150 in materials. Construction took 3 months of focused work. The design required careful planning and precise execution. These were not trivial barriers. But Mackenzie pointed out that losing a cabin to fire or having family members suffer frostbite also carried costs. The barn represented insurance against catastrophic winter problems. From that perspective, the investment was rational. Before Mackenzie left, he asked specific questions about adapting the design. Could a smaller barn work? Could existing barns be modified? What was the minimum effective air gap? Dunbar shared everything he had learned, including his mistakes and the modifications he would make if building again. The information exchange was detailed and technical. Mackenzie took notes, clearly planning his own construction project. When he finally departed back into the cold, he shook Dunbar's hand and said simply that the project was not folly after all. It was genius, disguised as madness. The crisis came on February 2nd during a blizzard that struck without adequate warning. Alistair Drummond lived 3 miles east with his wife Margaret and their 3 children, ages 9, 6, and 3. Their cabin was typical frontier construction, well built by normal standards but not exceptional. They had survived the January cold snap by burning enormous amounts of firewood and huddling close to their stove. When the February blizzard arrived, with wind-driven snow and falling temperatures, they followed their established routine, stoking the fire high and settling in to wait out the storm. Around midnight, their chimney failed. The exact cause was never determined, possibly creosote buildup that ignited, possibly structural failure from thermal stress, possibly a combination of factors. The chimney began pouring smoke into the cabin rather than venting it outside. Within minutes, the interior filled with thick smoke that made breathing difficult and visibility nearly zero. Alistair had no choice but to evacuate his family into the blizzard, despite knowing how dangerous that was. He wrapped the children in every blanket they owned, put his wife and oldest child on their one horse, and carried the younger children himself. They headed toward Dunbar's place, the nearest shelter. The journey of 3 miles took over 2 hours in conditions where visibility extended perhaps 20 feet. Alistair navigated by counting his steps and trying to maintain direction, knowing that getting lost meant death. The children were crying, terrified and cold. Margaret was singing to them, trying to keep them calm. The horse was reluctant but obedient, following Alistair's lead through drifts that reached its chest in places. The temperature was near zero, with wind that drove snow horizontally, creating wind chill far below that. Alistair later said he was certain they would not make it. They found Dunbar's barn by accident and providence. Alistair had drifted slightly south of where he thought he was, exhausted and disoriented. He literally walked into the barn's south wall in the darkness. He pounded on the wall, shouting, hoping someone would hear over the wind. Inside, Dunbar heard the thumping and went to investigate. He opened the small entry door to find Alistair holding two small children, both barely conscious from cold exposure, with Margaret and their oldest child on the horse behind him. Dunbar pulled them inside one by one. The barn interior felt warm compared to the blizzard, even though it was only 15 degrees. Margaret was hypothermic, shaking uncontrollably. The youngest child was not responding. Dunbar got them into the cabin immediately, stripped off wet outer clothing, wrapped them in dry blankets, and positioned them near the fire. He heated water and made them drink warm broth, forcing liquid into bodies that were shutting down from cold. The oldest child recovered quickly. Margaret gradually stopped shaking as core temperature rose. The youngest child remained dangerously cold for nearly an hour before finally showing signs of improvement. They stayed 3 days while the blizzard continued. The cabin that Dunbar had built for one person now held 6, crowded but safe. The barn cabin system maintained comfortable temperature throughout, despite the additional occupants and the continuous cold outside. Alistair experienced firsthand what Mackenzie had seen, the fundamental difference between surviving winter and being protected from it. Spring arrived late in 1868. Snow persisted through March, and April brought more winter storms before finally yielding to warmer weather. When settlers could finally travel and work outside comfortably, the barn cabin design became the dominant topic of conversation across the region. Alistair Drummond was vocal about how Dunbar's structure had saved his family's lives. Mackenzie had begun planning his own barn construction before the ground thawed. Others who had struggled through the brutal winter were reassessing their shelter situations with new urgency. Dunbar received visitors throughout April and May, homesteaders who wanted to see the barn and understand the construction principles. He gave tours freely, explaining the thermal concepts, showing his temperature documentation, and describing the building process in detail. Some visitors were convinced immediately. Others remained skeptical but interested. A few still thought the effort was excessive for the benefit gained, but no one could dispute the documented results. The barn interior was measurably warmer than exterior air, and the cabin interior maintained comfort with minimal fuel consumption. Alistair began construction in late May after planting was complete. His design was slightly smaller than Dunbar's, 36 feet by 24 feet, reflecting his smaller cabin and tighter budget. He had learned from Dunbar's experience and made modifications. His foundation was simpler, using stones set directly on hardpan rather than in trenches. His framework used slightly smaller timbers, still substantial but less expensive. The roof pitch was steeper, 10/12 instead of 8/12, based on his assessment that snow shedding was more important in his location. The variations showed that the core concept could be adapted to individual circumstances. Mackenzie started his barn in June, and his design included features Dunbar had not attempted. He built a small workshop space into one corner of the barn, sectioned off with partial walls, but still within the main structure. This gave him dedicated space for carpentry and repairs, work that could continue through winter in relative comfort. He also installed a small stove in the barn space itself, not for continuous heating, but for occasional use when working inside during extreme cold. The modifications demonstrated that the barn cabin concept was a framework others could build upon, rather than a rigid design requiring exact replication. By summer's end, 4 barn cabin structures were under construction within 10 miles of Dunbar's original. Each was different in details but consistent in principles. Foundations were solid. Frameworks were robust. Air gaps between cabin and barn were carefully sized. Doors were designed to seal well. Ventilation was passive and controlled. The builders learned from each other, sharing solutions to specific problems. The informal knowledge exchange accelerated improvement in techniques and efficiency. What had taken Dunbar 3 months to build was now achievable in 6 to 8 weeks with help from neighbors who understood the process. The broader homesteading community watched with interest. Some dismissed the barn cabin design as excessive preparation for problems that might never recur. The 1867 winter had been unusually severe. Perhaps future winters would be milder, making the investment unnecessary. But those who had nearly lost family members to cold, or who had burned through winter fuel supplies alarmingly fast, or who had simply been miserable for months, were willing to invest effort now to avoid repeating that experience. The winter of 1868 through 1869 provided the validation that skeptics required. Temperatures were not as extreme as the previous year, but cold was still substantial and persistent. The homesteaders who had built barn cabin structures reported consistent results. Interior temperatures remained comfortable with moderate heating. Firewood consumption was roughly half that of standard cabins. More significantly, families felt secure rather than anxious during cold weather. The psychological benefit of knowing you were protected, rather than merely surviving, changed how people experienced winter. Word spread beyond the immediate community. Travelers passing through the region mentioned the unusual barn structures they had seen. Settlers filing new claims asked existing homesteaders about winter survival strategies and heard about the barn cabin design. The territorial newspaper in Yankton ran a brief article describing the innovation, crediting Dunbar as the originator, but noting that several families had now adopted variations of the technique. The article reached readers across Dakota Territory and beyond, carrying the concept to regions where winter cold was a serious concern. Over the following 5 years, barn cabin construction became common enough in northern Dakota settlements that it was no longer considered unusual. The design evolved as different builders contributed improvements. Some built connected structures, where the cabin wall formed one wall of the barn, reducing construction time and materials. Others built freestanding cabins first, then added barns around them later as resources allowed. A few ambitious homesteaders built 2-story barns with sleeping lofts in the barn space itself, creating additional living area that was unheated but protected and usable most of the year. The technique spread to other cold climate regions. Montana settlers adopted it. Wyoming homesteaders built variations adapted to higher elevations and different wind patterns. Parts of Minnesota, where Scandinavian immigrants were establishing farms, saw barn cabin structures that incorporated building traditions from Nordic countries, creating hybrid designs that combined American frontier practicality with European cold climate expertise. Each region adapted the core concept to local conditions, materials, and needs. The impact on winter survival was measurable, though not systematically documented. Doctors and territorial officials in regions where barn cabin construction was common reported fewer cases of severe frostbite and cold-related illness. Winter mortality, while still significant from disease and accidents, declined noticeably in communities that had widely adopted improved shelter designs. The connection was not provable in a scientific sense, but was strongly suggested by the available evidence. Better protection from cold meant fewer people dying or suffering permanent injury from exposure. The architectural influence extended beyond homesteading. The United States Army, which maintained numerous frontier posts in cold regions, experimented with building barracks inside larger protective structures. Trading posts used similar double building designs for housing permanent staff. Remote mining operations in mountain regions adopted the technique for worker housing. The principle that surrounding a heated structure with an unheated but protected shell improved thermal performance became accepted wisdom among builders working in extreme climates. What had started as one man's response to personal tragedy became an established construction technique with broad application. Dunbar Macready died on March 14, 1889, at age 64. He had lived alone in his barn cabin for 22 years after Callum's death, never remarrying, never leaving the homestead he had claimed in 1866. His death was quiet and unremarkable. A brief mention in the territorial records and a small obituary noting his military service and years of successful farming. The obituary made no mention of the barn he had built or the technique he had pioneered. His property was purchased by a young family named Patterson. They moved into the barn cabin in April after Dunbar's belongings had been auctioned. The Pattersons were impressed by the structure's condition. After 22 years, the barn showed weathering but no structural deterioration. The roof remained sound. The doors still hung true. The foundation was solid. Inside, the cabin was protected by the barn shell that surrounded it. They experienced their first winter during 1889 through 1890. The structure maintained comfortable interior temperature with modest heating. Firewood consumption was far below what they had burned in their previous cabin. The children stayed healthy and comfortable. Mrs. Patterson wrote to her sister back east, describing the barn cabin as the most intelligently designed frontier dwelling she had encountered, though she did not know the full story of how or why it was built. By 1890, the barn cabin design was common enough in cold climate frontier regions that its origins had been largely forgotten. Builders knew the technique worked. Homesteaders knew it improved winter survival, but few could identify Dunbar Macready as the originator or knew about Callum Murchison's death that had motivated the construction. The knowledge had been absorbed into frontier building practice, becoming traditional wisdom passed from experienced settlers to newcomers without attribution. Modern historians studying frontier architecture eventually recognized the barn cabin design as a significant innovation. Analysis of surviving structures revealed that the technique emerged in Dakota Territory in the late 1860s and spread rapidly across northern plains and mountain regions. Researchers found references to Dunbar Macready in territorial records and settler accounts, though the full story remained largely unknown. The barn Dunbar built in 1867 still stands, now protected as a historic structure by the state of South Dakota. The cabin inside has been preserved with period furnishings. Visitors can walk through both structures, experiencing the air gap that provides thermal protection. Educational displays explain the engineering principles, crediting Dunbar as the designer. But what cannot be displayed is the grief that motivated the innovation, or the determination that drove him to build something his neighbors thought was insane, or the satisfaction he must have felt when his mathematics proved correct. Engineering is measured in temperatures and fuel consumption, but human motivation lives in memory and loss. Dunbar built his barn to survive the cold that had killed his partner, creating something that helped hundreds of others survive winters that would have killed them otherwise. That legacy proved more durable than the timber and nails that formed its physical expression.